Good evening and welcome to our fourth of four Character Development Speaker Series talks. This evening, I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker. Ryan Holiday is one of the world's best-selling living philosophers. His books include The Obstacle is the Way, Ego is the Enemy, The Daily Stoic, the #1 New York Times bestseller, Stillness is the Key, and other books about marketing, culture, and the human condition. Tonight, he will be referencing his book, Courage is Calling, Fortune Favors the Brave, from the Stoic Virtues series. Mr. Holiday's works have been translated into over 40 languages and have appeared everywhere, from the New York Times to Fast Company. His company, Brass Check, has advised companies such as Google, Taser, and Complex, as well as multi-platinum musicians and some of the biggest authors in the world. His bookstore, The Painted Porch, sits on historic Main Street in Bastrop, Texas. He lives outside Austin, Texas with his wife and 2 boys, and a small herd of cows, donkeys, and goats. Please join me in welcoming Ryan Holiday to the stage.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here with all of you tonight. You can have the rest of your chairs. I was here in 2019, it was 2020, right before the world changed so radically from the pandemic. I gave a talk at the Stockdale Center, and you all gave me a wonderful gift. You gave me a compass. And I would hope by now, I know you haven't been here too long, I hope you're all familiar with the cardinal points of a compass. Never eat shredded wheat. The cardinal points of the compass are interesting. It's interesting to me that they're called the cardinal points because they align quite nicely with what we call the cardinal virtues. Cardinal virtues: courage, temperance, justice, and wisdom. Some people think that because they're known as the cardinal virtues, they must have some religious connotation. This is contributed by the fact that these 4 virtues are the same virtues as Catholicism: courage, temperance, justice, wisdom. But in fact, as C.S. Lewis reminds us, they're called the cardinal virtues because they're derived from the Latin word cardos. Cardos means hinge. The idea is that these are the virtues that the door to the good life hangs on, not unlike the massive doors of your chapel. The hinge, these are pivotal virtues, virtues that one builds one's life around, virtues that are essential to being a good person, a good citizen, a good husband, a good wife, good soldier, right? These are the virtues that the good life depends on. We're going to talk about these virtues tonight. Specifically, though, we're going to talk about courage, which one might say is the North Star of the virtues. C.S. Lewis would famously say that courage is not one of the virtues, it is all of the virtues at their testing point. So when we think about courage, we're going to talk about it tonight. I think it's important to realize that courage isn't one thing, it's many things. I compare courage to a rare gem. You would hold it up, and each angle, each slice that you would look at it would give you a different bit of perspective, a different look, a different understanding. So we're going to talk about courage from a variety of different perspectives, but I think it's important to start with the big distinction, which is that it's long been held that there are 2 forms of courage. There's physical courage. This would be the courage of a soldier. This would be the courage of a firefighter. This would be the courage of a doctor or a nurse working the front lines in the middle of a pandemic. This is when one risks oneself physically, right? This is John Paul Jones, the American Revolution, putting the ship into the fight, putting one's self in physical danger despite the risk. There's also moral courage, right? Moral courage is when one puts oneself out there, not physically, but spiritually. They put their job on the line. They put their reputation on the line. They have to get over what other people think about them, what other people think about what they might do. So this is the courage of a whistleblower, of a groundbreaking scientist, of an entrepreneur, of all of you who left your old lives, who left the normal civilian world to come here and do this thing. Moral courage is Captain Brett Crozier on the USS Theodore Roosevelt, right? This is putting one's job, one's reputation, one's future at risk for something you think is important, for something that other people are afraid to do. But I actually don't think there's much difference between these two forms of courage. They might look different, but at the core they are the same. They are putting your ass on the line, right? They are putting skin in the game. They're putting yourself out there. They're stepping forward when others might step back, when you might have every reason to step back. So let's look at some forms of this courage, what it looks like literally and figuratively to put one's ass on the line. In the year 79 AD, Mount Vesuvius erupts and overwhelms a town called Pompeii, not far from Rome. There was a Roman admiral and naturalist. His name was Pliny the Elder. Pliny the Elder hears of the eruption, and he's interested in, at first, at the scientific discoveries. So he rushes to the scene. He's got the Roman fleet. He rushes his ships to Pompeii as quickly as he can. He thinks he might discover something. There might be some scientific breakthrough, something he could learn, something he could write about, just to witness some insane natural event. But then his captain tells him, no, we can't go. It's too dangerous. And he utters this famous phrase, fortes fortuna uvat, which basically means fortune favors the brave, or fortune favors the bold. It's a famous Latin expression. His point was, you got to put your ass on the line. You got to take a risk, right? He wants to discover something. He has to put himself out there. He has to rush to the scene, even though it's dangerous, even though it's risky. But on the way, Pliny learns something else, which is it's not just an interesting scientific event, but that there's a real danger. And in fact, Pompeii has been flash frozen by the ash, that people are dying. And in fact, one of his closest friends, a senator, is there, trapped, and needs to be rescued. This changes the tenor of the mission. It's no longer a fact-finding mission, it's a rescue mission. And he rushes to the scene, and he rescues his friend. But it's important that we realize this phrase, fortune favors the bold, is incomplete. He's not saying that fortune favors the bold, that you just take risks, you just be courageous in life. It's more complicated than that. The full expression here is fortes fortuna ibuat Pompanium Pete. He says, fortune favors the bold, speed to my friend, right? He is saying, I'm rushing out there, fortune favors me because it's not about me, right? It's about the person that I'm trying to help. He does end up rescuing this senator, but he himself dies in the process. So when we say that fortune favors the bold, again, this is an important slice of this idea. Fortune favors the bold, but it doesn't guarantee success, right? The gods may smile on you because you are doing the right thing, but no one can guarantee this success. But it's important that we think of courage in this context. There is, of course, just courage anytime you risk yourself. But why one is doing this is obviously always the important part. The virtues balance themselves out. Courage is all the virtues at their testing point. But what good is this courage if not directed towards justice, if not directed selflessly, if not directed towards the right cause? A crazy fact, they actually just recently discovered Pliny the Elder's body in 2020. This is all that is left of him. He says fortune favors the bold, but again, favors is the operative word. There are no guarantees. One has to be willing to risk everything to truly put one's ass on the line. This is a quote from the poet Lord Byron. He says, "'Tis the cause makes all that degrades or hallows courage in its fall." Pliny the Elder dying to make a scientific discovery is interesting, it's brave. But Pliny the Elder dying to rescue his friend takes on a heroic component. So why we are courageous, what we are courageous for, obviously matters. Are you being courageous for, as the great John Boyd said, duty, honor, country? Are these the virtues that are guiding you, or is it pride, power, and greed? Why are you being courageous, right? What is motivating you? What at the character level is guiding you? And this distinction when it comes to courage is everything. This is future Lieutenant Commander Wesley Brown, class 49. He actually was offered an opportunity to go to West Point, but a black man had already graduated from West Point. He wasn't the first black man accepted here at Annapolis. He was actually the 6th, but the 5 others before him had not graduated. This wasn't because they weren't capable. It wasn't because they weren't courageous. It wasn't because they weren't groundbreaking pioneers. It's because they were hazed out of Annapolis. They were treated cruelly. They were driven out, right? This is a long time ago, but not that long ago. They were driven out. They were not allowed to graduate. And what I think is so interesting about Lieutenant Commander Wesley Brown is that's precisely why he decided to go here instead of West Point. He said it was the greater challenge. He went towards the difficulty. He wanted to shatter a ceiling, break down a barrier, and he went towards where it was hardest. And it was extremely hard. He would explain later that there was a deliberate campaign, not just to haze him, not just to treat him cruelly, not just to make him feel unwelcome, but there was a campaign by upperclassmen to deliberately give him demerits, to hopefully bounce him out of the academy, and this went on for a number of years. He would reflect that it was unfortunate that the American people had not matured enough to accept an individual on the basis of his race and to accept him because of who he was. But he said, my class standing shows around here that I'm actually the average Joe. His point was that he was about ranked 300 in a class of 700 or 800. He was right there in the middle. He wasn't better or worse than anyone else. He was your average Joe. But I think we can all, as we think about what he would have gone through in those years here, he was far from average. He was, in fact, extraordinary, extraordinarily brave, extraordinarily disciplined, extraordinarily self-contained, and that's what got him through. But there was one other thing that helped him, and it was this man. This is Jimmy Carter, class of 46, who ran cross-country with Wesley Brown. And they were friends. And when he saw that he was being picked on, that he was being hazed, that he was being treated unfairly because of the color of his skin, one day walking through the halls, he put his arm around him. We can imagine the courage and the unexpectedness of this move from a man who was raised in segregated Georgia, who didn't know, who might have easily just been part of the problem. He instead makes himself a part of the solution. They become friends. He supports him. He encourages him to keep going. And he writes Wesley Brown a letter many years later. He says, I ran with you, but you were better. He was braver. He had to work harder. He had to do more. And ultimately, he comes out of the other side. He graduates, becomes lieutenant commander, as I said. I think it's interesting that in 2008, the Naval Academy named your field house after him. It's a beautiful building, a state-of-the-art facility. But it's interesting, I think it's worth pointing out that for close to 100 years, there were buildings on this campus named for Confederate graduates. Another word for that would be traitors. We have no problem recognizing courage in people who are just like us. We don't want to think about what other people have gone through, the challenges and the battles that they fought, what they went through. And actually, it takes even longer for a woman to graduate from the Naval Academy. This is Elizabeth Rowe, class of 80.
26.
This is Janine Mines, class of 80 also.
26.
So I point this out not because I want to get woke on you. There's some concern that the Navy's becoming too woke by talking about these things, by exploring these things. It's unpleasant. What's the point? Shouldn't we be celebrating our virtues? Why do we have to get bogged down in these unpleasant things, right? Why do we have to dwell on the past? I think this would have been a rather strange idea to Admiral Stockdale, class of 43.
26.
At Stanford, the Navy sends him to Stanford after his time in the Navy, after he graduates from here. And at Stanford, he takes a number of master's courses in philosophy. And there, one of his favorite classes, the class that influences him the most, next to the class where he is introduced to Stoic philosophy, is a class on Marxism. He said, we read only the primary documents. For a whole semester, they did nothing but immerse themselves in communist theory. He said, all year we read the works of Marx and Lenin. And then here's where this comes in. He says, in Hanoi, I understood more about Marxist theory than my interrogators did. He was actually able to tease his interrogators that he knew more about their ideas than they did, right? This was a man who wasn't afraid to study controversial ideas, that wasn't afraid to be labeled, that wasn't afraid to look at criticisms, that wasn't afraid to have his beliefs challenged. General Mark Milley famously does this in a congressional hearing recently, who's asked if he's becoming too woke, if the Army's becoming too woke. And he says, look, I've read Mao, I've read Marx, I've read Lenin. He says, that doesn't make me a communist. He says, what's wrong with understanding, with having situational understanding about the country for which we are here to defend? This is an essential idea. This is what your career here is going to be about. This is the lifelong journey that you have to undergo as leaders. The pursuit of knowledge is not for the faint of heart. It will demand courage from you. If the history that you study and you read about, if it doesn't make you uncomfortable, you're probably not studying history, right? You're studying propaganda, you're studying myth, you're studying lies, you're studying reassuring myths, right? If you only look for stuff that you agree with, right, you will not learn, you will not grow, you will not be able to tighten your own arguments, you will not be able to get better. If your deepest held beliefs aren't regularly challenged, you are being a coward. You have to seek out controversial ideas. You have to seek out the things they want to ban, that they don't want you to think about. You have to seek them out. If you think that things are simple, right, that history can be described in a few sentences, that you've got a really clear grasp of this thing that you've read one book on, again, you are doing it wrong. General James Mattis would say that the greatest gift that his parents gave him, and if your parents didn't give you this, then your professors here can. He said that his parents introduced him and his brother to the world of great ideas, not a fearful place, but a place to enjoy. To enjoy the challenge, to enjoy the pursuit, to enjoy the uncertainty and the ambiguity and the nuance and the differing views. He sought that out. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, would famously say that we should read like a spy in the enemy's camp. I think this metaphor is particularly important for you all here. You should understand why your enemies think the way that they do. You should think about what they think about you, right? You should think about the ideas that you disagree with. You should read the alternative histories. You should read the ideas that challenge you. Seneca writes his book, Letters of a Stoic, a series of letters to his friend Lucilius, who is teaching about Stoicism. What I think is so interesting about this book, and I spoke to one of your classes that was teaching Stoicism earlier this year, what's so interesting about Seneca's letters is that the philosopher he quotes the most is not a Stoic at all. He quotes Epicurus, ostensibly his rival, the philosophical school that was diametrically opposed to his. He could quote from memory and quotes more than any other philosopher, right? So he can disagree with, so he can challenge the ideas, but also so he can get value from their ideas. He says, which I love, he says, I'll quote a bad author if the line is good. There is value in these other ideas. You don't have to agree with all of them, but there is value in all of them. And you have to be open to exploring them and studying them, especially, not just even if they make you uncomfortable, but especially because they make you uncomfortable. Epictetus, another Stoic philosopher, would say, it's impossible to learn that which you think you already know. So if you have a handle on it, if you think you got this, because someone talked to you about it when you were a kid, because you already took a history class, because you already read a book about this, because you saw something about it on the news, you have frozen yourself in place. The scientific method is about the embracing of that uncertainty. It's about testing hypothesis. Socrates, famously the wisest man in the world, is wise. Why? According to the oracle at Delphi, it's because he knows what he doesn't know. He knows that he knows nothing. He's willing to learn. The Socratic method, as you will learn here, is about what? It's about the asking of questions over and over and over again. It's not about assertions, right? It's about asking. Zeno, another Stoic philosopher, would say that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth. We should respect that ratio properly. The point being, we should always be open to new ideas. General Mattis is not just open to new ideas, but study deeply, intensely in all the topics that will matter in our life and in our careers. He says, as leaders, you cannot afford to learn by trial and error because other people pay that cost. The men and women who will end up serving underneath you, you're paying out of their backs, out of their blood, when you learn lessons by experience that you could have learned from books, that you could have learned from people like Pliny the Elder who were doing what you did 2,000 years ago, or who even further back. For 5,000 years, Mattis says, we've been going over the same topics, learning the same lessons. He says, if you haven't read hundreds of books, if you haven't studied deeply into history, he says, you are functionally illiterate. It doesn't matter that you can read, it matters that you do read. And Epictetus would say it doesn't just matter that you do read, it matters what you read. So you have to learn and study widely. But what I think is interesting about this learning, and I am encouraging you to seek out challenging ideas that are not as rosy and as clean and as gratifying and as inspiring, some of the myths that we hold as a nation, that we teach young school children, that you learned as kids, right? You have to seek out these challenging ideas, and some of them will rock you to your very core. And it's easy when you do that to come away cynical, right? To criticize, right? To even become hopeless, to embrace a kind of nihilism. But you can't do that, right? It's easy to give into that darkness, but we can't, right? Where would we be if everyone became cynical? If everyone wrote this country off, if wrote our progress and our potential off? You can't do that. Nicholas Mosley, the novelist, would say that it's almost taboo these days to believe that life has any meaning, right? Because we have so much information, because we can see the past so unflinchingly, because of the breakthroughs and the scholarship that's been done, it's hard to go back to that, 1950s mythology, right? It's easy to get hopeless when you see that, but you can't. What I think is so interesting about Stockdale is Stockdale was in the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964. He was there. He would say later, nothing happened, right? Who were we shooting at? Who was shooting at us? He saw it there himself, right? The reason that we go to war in Vietnam, that we expand our presence there, he was there and he saw, in a sense, a lie that his government told, right? To me, what's so fascinating, what makes his time in the Hanoi Hilton, his unbreakable character, his loyalty, his integrity, his patriotism, it makes it all the more impressive. You see what he went through, right? You see what he endured. And he did that as someone who did not have an unvarnished view of his own country, someone who had studied Marx, who had studied conflicting ideas, right? This wasn't just a rah-rah patriotism guy. This was a guy who'd seen some shit with his own eyes, and yet still he believed, still he appealed to the better angels, right? Still he saw hope in the future, still he saw the goodness in this country. That's the trick, to study history and to still find the goodness, to still find something in hope, to hope with. What I think about this idea that Stockdale was there, that he saw what happened in the Gulf of Tonkin, and yet still he served, and still he remained unbroken after all those years of terrible torture in that prison camp. This is what a world filled with gray is like, right? This is what it demands. The poet Longfellow says that life is real, life is earnest. That's true, we need real and earnest people. But life is also very complicated. It's complex, it's contradictory. There are no very clear good and bad guys. I wish there were, but there aren't, right? Life is gray, life is complicated, life is contradictory, but so are the best people, so are all of us. We are complicated, we contain multitudes, right? part of the study of history, part of fearlessly diving into the world of ideas is understanding this complexity, not lying to yourself about it, seeing that good people can do bad things, that bad people can be made to do good things, and that actually no one is totally good or pure. No motives are totally good or pure, and they're quite complicated. We cannot give up hope. I was speaking with General Mattis after the events of January 6th, and I was quite depressed about it. I was quite alarmed by it. And he told me a story, actually a story from John McCain, also class of 43, I believe. He said that John McCain would tell him that it's always darkest before the dawn, but he says sometimes it's also darkest right before it gets darker again, right? He said it's complicated, right? But you have to hang in there. And he said, keep the faith, hold the line. To me, that's what we take away from this study of history. If you've read Cormac McCarthy's The Road, he talks about carrying the fire, right? I think as we study history, as we see what's good and bad, all that's left after we step back from that is to try to carry the fire, to be one of the good guys, as they say in that book. Okay, to go back to Jimmy Carter again, class of 46?
46!
Carter comes to the Naval Academy, he graduates, he enters the submarine service. This is his wife, Rosalind. They've now been married for 70 years. It's incredible. He graduates, enters the submarine service, and he wants to get on one of the nuclear subs. This is a new thing at the time. And he goes to interview with Admiral Rickover, class of 22. 100 years ago. Pretty crazy, right? Rickover is one of the most hands-on leaders in American history, certainly in US naval history. He not only personally tests every submarine before it goes into service, but he interviews every single officer in the submarine service. And so Carter secures an interview with him, and they sit. It's a long interview, 2 or 3 hours, and they talk about everything. They talk about physics, they talk about strategy, they talk about tactics, they talk about literature. Everything that Rickover can possibly ask, he asks. And then as the interview is winding down, Carter thinks it's gone pretty well. He looks at him and he says, so how did you fare in your class at the Naval Academy? Carter, beaming with pride, sort of puffs himself up, and he says, I was 52nd in a class of 700. He's quite proud of this. But then Rickover, who's not ever been one to particularly respect rank, to particularly respect academic standing, he asks Carter a question that changes the course of Carter's life. He says, did you always do your best? And Carter stops, and he wants to say yes, as we all would. If someone asks, are you doing your best? Are you putting everything you have into it? Are you giving 100%? But then he catches himself. He stops for a second, and he thinks about classes that he coasted through. He thinks about workouts where he had a little bit left, but he didn't go all the way. He thought about moments where he let his natural talents do most of the work, where he wasn't pushing himself, where he wasn't actually fully invested, other extra opportunities he could have jumped on that he declined. And he realizes that, no, he didn't always do his best. And he says this to Rickover. He says, no, sir, I don't think I always did my best. And Rickover asks him a question. He says, why not? And then he signals that the interview is over and he leaves the room. And this question haunts Jimmy Carter for the rest of his life. Why didn't he always give his best? This was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. But it wasn't just about regret, about opportunities not fully taken advantage of. It was about the future. Would he always give his best in everything that he did? Going forward, would he always give 100%? Would he truly try? And I think about this challenge, this question, am I giving my best? Am I fully giving my best? And when I think about my own life, I'm not sure that I always have. I was talented when I was your age. I was ambitious. But did I coast by on natural talent? Were there opportunities that I didn't chase down? Questions that I could have asked? Things that I could have done? Almost certainly so. I didn't get into anywhere close to a college like this because I didn't even think about trying that hard. And I think about how my life could have been different had I done that. I think about this as a writer. Every book that I do, did I put everything I had into it, or did I say, this is good enough. This will get me where I need to go. Am I settling? I think about why I did that. I think about why people do that, particularly at your age. I think about a quote that my mentor, the great Robert Greene, would say to me. He said, "We often strike a pose that's simultaneously rebellious and lackadaisical." He said it's a way of staying in place. Because trying harder, putting yourself out there, truly giving everything you have to everything you are doing, it's inherently risky. Because if it doesn't work, you can't tell yourself that you didn't care, that you weren't really trying, that you could have done better. You have to sit with the honesty of that failure, of that falling short, of that criticism. And that is a scary thing, right? Losing hurts less, he says, when you embrace it. But I don't think for you guys, none of you are going to lose. It's more like security in the middle hurts less. It's less scary. The stakes are lower. There is safety in those numbers. And to try to always give your best is to put yourself in a far more precarious position. It will make you more successful, but it's a more precarious position. And so this guides Carter his whole life, ultimately to the presidency. He does serve on nuclear subs. It guides him to the presidency. But I think it's interesting because few people think of Jimmy Carter as our best president. I think this is a shame. I think he's an incredible American. He's certainly our best ex-president. But even as a president, I think he deserves to be up there with Truman in only one term, which many people think he only served one term, because Carter made a lot of hard decisions early on in his presidency that probably cost him re-election. He didn't save anything. He did his best in every moment. He tried to do the right thing in every moment, which is not a thing that politicians often do. He embraced what was in front of him. He gave his best. But famously, Carter was way ahead of the curve when it came to America's dangerous dependence on foreign energy. And what Carter does, he gives a speech early on in his presidency. He says, America needs a moral equivalent to war where we seek out alternative forms of energy, where we get rid of our foreign oil dependence, right? As we're seeing right now with the conflict with Russia, had we listened to Carter, things might have been different. We might have more leverage. We might have more strength. Carter famously puts solar panels on the White House in 1976, panels that were immediately ripped off by his successors. America more or less laughs at this. They think he's being silly. They think he doesn't know what he's talking about. They shrug off this moral equivalent of war, and we're paying for that today. But Rickover, talking about the courage to try, talking about the courage to risk failing, to risk shame, to risk criticism, to lose re-election, as Carter ultimately does, this is the hardest thing to do in the world. But it's worth it, because you can sleep at night, because you know you gave your best, right? Because you know you were right. And Rickover would say of Carter's presidency that there is no question that ultimately the public will come to understand how great Carter was, that he did what he had to do, that he tried to protect the American people. And he says that even Jesus Christ early in his life would have been seen as a failure. It's only in retrospect that we understand what greatness is. And he says, as long as a man is trying as hard as he can to do what he thinks to be right, he is a success regardless of the outcome. This is Carter, I think, in a nutshell. But this has to be all of us in a nutshell. Are we giving our best, or are we holding back? Are we seeking out the safety because we're afraid? Are we seeking out the safety of staying in the middle? I think about someone like Florence Nightingale. She's born rich, secure life, doesn't have to do anything. There's no expectations for her. She gets a call to greatness. She hears a voice that tells her to be of service. Why doesn't she immediately jump on this? It's because she's afraid, like many of us are. We have some destiny. We have something we're called to do, but stuff gets in the way. She hears a voice after 8 years of ignoring this call. The voice says to her, are you going to let reputation hold you back? Are you going to let what other people think hold you back? And I think the reality is, for many of us, the answer is yes. This is why we don't try. This is why we don't risk. This is why we don't put ourselves out there. We're afraid. We're afraid of reputation. We're afraid of what other people think. We're afraid of the results. This is a shame. Actually, you think about the hero's journey. What's the second step on the hero's journey? You get the call to adventure, and then there is the refusal of the call. Each of us has this destiny, but we ignore it, right? Each of us has a destiny, something we were meant to do in life, but stuff gets in the way. My friend Stephen Pressfield, who writes Gates of Fire, he's a Marine also, he calls this the resistance. He says you feel the resistance between you and that thing that you were meant to do, whether it's sitting down and writing or it's putting yourself out there, seeking out a promotion, seeking out a leadership position, seeking out something untraditional or unusual, being your true self, right? The resistance gets between us and that because we're afraid of what other people think. We're afraid of what's going to happen if we try. There's my other friend, Jack Carr, a Navy SEAL, does tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. I imagine the call he feels after he retires to become a writer, to write thrillers, right? It seems great in retrospect. It's been a huge success. He has the #1 show on Amazon. His books have sold millions of copies. Everyone supports you when it works out. But there's that period where it doesn't. There's the period where you look foolish, where you're trying, where you have to learn, right? Where you have to ask questions, right? When you're not good. And this is what the resistance tries to protect you from. This is why it says stay in the middle of the pack. This is why it says don't buck convention. This is why it says don't really try. Because the resistance wants to protect you from that awkwardness, from that judge, from those judges, from those looks. But good things are on the other side of that risk. The destiny, the thing you are capable of being, the thing that can change the world, that can bring people joy and insight or safety or any number of wonderful things, it's on the other side of that risk. Churchill would say that each of us has this special moment when we are tapped on the shoulder and offered a chance to do something special, unique to us and fitted to our talents. He says, what a tragedy if that moment finds us unprepared or afraid and we miss our finest hour. I think what's interesting about what all of you have gone through in the last month and will go through over the next several years is that you all came here as individuals from unique backgrounds, unique parents. You have totally unique DNA. But what this academy does, what the process of becoming a warrior does, is it makes you like everyone else. This is why you have to get the same haircuts, why you have to wear the same uniforms, why you go to the same classes, why you eat the same way, why you sit the same way, why you march the same way. It's a process about making you something bigger than yourself, which means by definition not yourself, right? It's about making you part of a collective, losing you in that cohesive whole. Armed services would not work without this process. But the paradox of it, the paradox of all the training, of the indoctrination, of the code, of the ethos, of the education that you will undergo, is that when you graduate, you must remain an individual. You must remain you. And this is true in all forms of life. I started my career in the creative arts as an assistant to a talent manager in Hollywood, a movie producer. And I was struck even then that the process of answering these phones a certain way, getting coffee a certain way, being yelled at a certain way, it was about breaking me down, about making me part of a system, about picking up a code, a system, a way of thinking, which was great. It's the language that you have to know to be able to be successful in that field, kind of. It's a recipe for being a cog in a wheel, a part of a machine. But ultimately, to succeed, to be great, to do something unique, you still have to be you. You have to figure out how to remain an individual, even within the code and culture and community in which you are a part. Seneca, talking about philosophy, says, philosophy is going to come and it's going to challenge you, and it's going to challenge your deepest held beliefs, and it's going to make you realize that the things that other people care about, the way that they dress, the things that they do, that so many of these things are pointless, that they don't matter. And yet, he says, still you have to do them, right? He said, on the outside, we should be like everyone else, but inside, the thing that's important is that the philosophy changes who you are on the inside, right? That's what matters. I had a boss once, he was a helicopter pilot in Vietnam, and he told me that as he was getting his head shaved off to go to boot camp, he was asked, he had long hair, and the guy cutting his hair said, so were you a hippie on the outside? And he said, no, sir, I'm a hippie on the inside. I love that, right? What matters is who you are on the outside. The external appearances, they don't matter. You have to figure out how to play the game. You have to figure out how to not get kicked out. You have to figure out every part of the system. You have to figure out how it works. It does matter. And yet, in another sense, it totally doesn't matter. It can't strip you of the individuality that will ultimately be required to become the person that you are meant to be, to do the things that you are meant to do for yourself, but also for your country. This is a young Margaret Thatcher. She graduates from college. She wants to be a chemist. And as she's being interviewed, she can see the man writing notes on her paper. He writes, "This woman is much too difficult to work for this company." Which is a horrible thing to say, but also he was totally right. She was way too difficult to work there, and that's what made her the Iron Lady. That's what made her great, right? If she had changed that, if she had lost that, she wouldn't have been the person that her country needed. This is de Gaulle. De Gaulle would say, people criticize me as being difficult to work with. Churchill said this over and over again. Why are you so difficult? And de Gaulle responded, if I were easy to work with, I would still be a member of Pétain's staff, right? If de Gaulle wasn't difficult, if he didn't march to the beat of his own drummer, if he didn't stick to what was true and good inside him, he would have been like everyone else who stayed, right? Who cooperated with the Nazis. You need that internal compass more than anything else. Think about John Lewis, who's arrested 25 times in pursuit of civil rights. This smile on his face, to me, this is the embodiment of what he would call good trouble, right? You have to go along, but you can't go along to get along. You have to be willing to create good trouble. Each of you will encounter challenges and bureaucracy and the way we've always done things, right? And it's here, when you witness things, when you are offered things, when you see what would be easier, what everyone else does, when you see the way to get ahead, it's here that the you-ness will matter the most, that you will have to have the courage to be that person, to do what you know is right. You may well be asked to do things, and you can't, right? This is when you will matter. This is when that internal compass truly comes into play. Because only an individual can make a decision, right? Only an individual can have a conscience. Only an individual can be a hero. So it's wonderful. I am jealous that all of you are part of this enormous thing, this culture that dates back almost 2 centuries here in America and thousands of years of warriors, one after another, a passing of torches. You are a part of that. And yet, you must also maintain that sense of who you are within this, because that's what destiny will demand of you. So I think about this moment as you all come together, and when you celebrate a few years from now your graduation, as you see yourself marching in a giant line of your fellow officers, I want you to also think of this picture. I think it's one of the most moving pictures ever captured on film. This is taken in 1936 in Nazi Germany. That's August Landmasser. He's the only one not giving a Nazi salute. Everyone around him had bought into a thing. Every one of them had been corrupted. Every one of them had taken safety in numbers, was going along to get along. And there he was, marching to the beat of his own drummer, staying true to what he was. And again, right, fortune favors the brave. It doesn't guarantee anything. He would lose almost everything for this stand. But who would challenge the righteousness and the honor and the bravery of that stand? So as we wrap up, and I'm excited to talk with all of you, I think about Churchill. This is the epic series. If I would recommend a series of books to you, there's a 3-book trilogy by William Manchester about Winston Churchill. But I think it's imperative to take a minute to meditate on this middle book. The middle book of the series, 1932 to 1940, is just titled Alone. Churchill stands alone for 8 years. Leadership is a lonely thing. It is a hard thing. It is a lonely thing. And there is courage in that stand, but I wanted to wrap up tonight about another form of courage, which is the understanding that none of us can make it alone. I know I just talked about individuality. It's a tension here, individuality, and then you are also part of an organization, part of a team. You all have a band of brothers that everyone else in the civilian world is jealous of. Marcus Aurelius, a soldier himself, he spends most of his reign at the front with his soldiers. He would write in Meditations that we should not be ashamed to need and ask for help. He said, we are like soldiers storming a wall when we have a mission to accomplish. If you have been wounded and you need a comrade to pull you up, so what? He says, so what if you have to ask for help? I think it's important to meditate on this because as individuals, as courageous people, as strong people, as people who fought to get where we are, as people who are always trying to give our best, we can be hesitant to do that, to ask for help. But we need to have the courage to be able to do that. I think of Pliny the Elder rushing to help his hurt friend, right? He doesn't resent his friend for this. It's an opportunity. He's glad to do it. I think of Carter and Wesley Brown. I think about them helping each other, and I love that. That's what we're here for. That's what it's about, right? And so we have to be willing, we have to be brave enough to ask for that help, to not be afraid to say that we're struggling, to not be afraid to say we don't know how to do something, that we need clarity on something, that we want to learn how to do something better, right? You don't get help that you don't ask for most of the time, right? You don't get help you're afraid to ask for. You don't get stronger when you're afraid of looking weak, right? To not ask for help that you need is selfish. It is depriving this country, your comrades, of you at your full capacity, you at your best. You have to be brave enough to be willing to do that. There's a book I love to read to my children. It's called The Boy, the Fox, the Horse, and the Mole. And in one of the pages it says, asking for help isn't giving up, it's refusing to give up. That's the tenacity of courage, to ask for help, to put oneself out there, to be willing to be seen as foolish, to be seen as vulnerable. You have to be strong enough to do that. I think of Stockdale, and I think about the family that got him through that. I think about his wife, Sybil. It's the highest honor that an active duty spouse can get. Her advocacy for POWs, it continues to this day, that legacy that comes out of that. None of us can make it by ourselves. None of us are in this alone. We have to be willing to lean on other people, to open up, to share, right? We have to be willing to do that. Stockdale talks about the Stockdale paradox, this idea that you have to accept unflinchingly the reality of your situation, but then there also has to be, with that hardness, a kind of pliability and adaptability, a willingness to grow and change and integrate new information, integrate help, bring people in, be something for other people. The code word in the Hanoi Hilton was US, which doesn't stand for United States. It stood for unity over self, that they were in it together, that they needed to lean on each other. And the code they would tap to each other through those walls was often to fellow prisoners who had just come back from torture, who felt terrible about what they had just undergone, who couldn't in any human way have fully resisted what they went through. And they were there to help each other out, but they were also there to ask for help from each other. Hemingway, in one of his best passages, would talk about how if we come into the world with so much courage and strength, he says the world will break us. He says if we don't break, the world will kill us. If we can't ask for help, if we can't be vulnerable, if we are too rigid, he said the world kills us. But he says if we can break, he says we can become strong in the broken places after, right? There's a Japanese form of art called kintsugi. And they'll take a broken bowl, a porcelain bowl, and they'll glue it back together, not with glue, but with gold or silver. And so a broken piece of pottery becomes more valuable for what it goes through. When one has the courage to change, to adapt, to not see it as what it was, but what it's capable of becoming. And this is what all of you will undergo. This is what all of us go through in life. Life breaks us. It challenges us. We go through heartaches and divorces, and we make mistakes. We lose out on things. There are bankruptcies. There are tragedies. There is pain always. If we think that we can just resist this, not feel it, that we don't need anyone when we face that pain, we will set ourselves up for greater pain in the future, and as Hemingway said, eventually kind of death. But if we're strong enough to embrace the tension of that Stockdale paradox, of the beauty of kintsugi, then we can become something better, something greater. Audie Murphy, the most decorated American in all of the armed forces, would say, concludes his beautiful and haunting memoir, To Hell and Back. He says, life faces us. He says, I swear to myself that I will measure up to it. He says, I may be branded by what I've experienced, but I will not be defeated by it. That's what courage is to me. That's true moral courage. That's the courage that each of you have to cultivate. And so as I conclude tonight, I would thank you for having me. I would thank you for your service. I will thank you for taking the ideas of Stockdale and the Stoics and applying them where they are meant to be applied, which is the real world. And I'll leave you with Mattis's words about keeping the faith and holding the line, and a reminder that fortune favors the brave. Thank you all very much.
We'll have some time for a few questions. So to ask a question, once recognized by the speakers, please stand, state your name and company, and then ask your question in a loud voice. You may then be seated as the speaker addresses your question.
Who's first? All right, go for it. A beginning writer? Write every day. Be willing to write for a very long time and get almost no recognition or credit for it. It takes a long time to master any profession, but the willingness to put out work and grow from the criticism and the feedback from it, that's everything. I started my first website in 2006. And my first book came out in the summer of 2012. And it didn't do particularly well either. So it takes a long time. So that would be the settle in for the long haul and do it because you have to do it, not because you think it would be fun to do it, if that makes sense. Yes? Yeah, I think about courage, when I think about courage in my own life, I was thinking about this, I write, there's an afterword in the book, and I think all of you get the book. I talk about some of my experiences. I'm certainly not writing this book from the position of someone who is lecturing anyone about courage. Courage is something I struggle with in my own life, that I have struggled with at times in my own life, and when I think about the things that I regret the most, what they all have in common was that I had reasons at the time why I didn't need to or shouldn't do the thing that I knew was probably the right thing to do, right? So these reasons, these excuses that we come up with, I have found in my relatively short life, they don't age well, right? The reasons that felt reassuring at the time or convincing at the time or persuasive at the time, they don't age well. Marcus Aurelius in Meditation says, just that you do the right thing, the rest doesn't matter. But in my own life, I was a marketer at a very big company that was controversial, got a lot of attention. There were things I could have done and should have done earlier that I was afraid to do. And mostly I was afraid of losing my job, which, as I think about it in retrospect, I go, what kind of job is it that doing the right thing could cost you that job? Why would that be a job that you would want to keep? And it gives me a lot of both sympathy and respect for whistleblowers, for people who put their ass on the line in that way, because losing one's job can feel like a kind of death, right? Risking one's reputation or being on the out group with your peers. This is as scary to people as rushing out on the battlefield. And I know this, not from my personal experience, but from the fact that we see in Washington all the time, people who performed quite bravely in combat, act politically as complete cowards. And that is the reality of the tribal human species, which is that we do not want to be in the out-group. And we will often go along with things that are totally unjust because we are worried that other people will cast us out. Right here. Yeah, that's a great question. I think when I think about the best decision I have ever made in my life, I relate to something that Winston Churchill said. He said his greatest achievement was convincing Clementine Churchill to marry him. Having a person in your life, a person who is on your team, male or female, who backs you, who understands you better than yourself in many ways, I think is how we get out of our own heads, how we get out of those reasons. There's a famous story that I'm writing about in the book that I'm doing now about Ernie Fitzgerald, a whistleblower in the United States Air Force and later in the Pentagon. He's asked to testify in front of Congress, and his superiors sort of tell him to act dumb, pretend he doesn't know. And his wife says, "I don't think I could live with a man who would do that," right? Having someone on your team who bucks you up, who challenges you, who understands you, who both cares for and encourages you, I think is a incredibly critical part. I know in our generation and younger generations, people marry later. They think relationships get in the way of their career, that being with someone can hold them back, if it's not just holding them back from having fun, but holding them back from being able to fully invest in their career. I get that, and I don't want to judge anyone's lifestyle decisions, but I would say that probably the single best decision I ever made was my decision to marry my wife, who I've been with since I was 19 years old. There's two of you, but you can fight it out. All right, yeah, go for it.
So I was in the fourth class day, hotel company. You mentioned the importance of individuality and staying true to yourself. How do we, as individuals in this environment, when it's not the individual that counts, but the group, stay true to that ideal and continue to form our own identity?
This is why I think it's so important to study history, to study groups, to study, even though you are physically here, even though you are part of this culture, even though you're a part of this country and this ethos, to understand and to read widely, to travel through books, to travel through friendships and relationships with people. I think when talking about the work situation that I was in, the reason I was never fully sucked into it, why I didn't debase myself the way that certain people in that environment had, why I was eventually able to do what was demanded of me, was because of the other interests and identities and exploration I had done outside of the environment that I was in. Does that make sense? So we need to have a diverse group of people around us. We have to pop what they call the filter bubble, the people who are just like us, who have the experiences just like us, who think just like us. I think it's really important that you have a varied and diverse identity, that you're not just in one thing like all these people. You need to spread those interests out. That's how you get that perspective, or you keep that distance or identity. I think that's really essential.
Sir, Mr. Fourth Class Schmidt, Delta Company, do you have any book recommendations for us that you found had a major impact on your life, sir?
Sure, a lot. I would read Marcus Aurelius' Meditations. This is the private journal of the most powerful man in the world, not writing for publication, but writing for his own edification. He's working through the struggles of command, of leadership. This is a book that General Mattis carries with him everywhere he goes, that's been a guide to some of the greatest thinkers and artists and leaders in all of human history. So I would give you that. I would give you Robert Greene's book, The 48 Laws of Power, which is to me a guide of the timeless dynamics of groups and human nature and power. And then I might give you, I just interviewed him for my podcast. Robert Coram wrote a brilliant book about Colonel John Boyd called Boyd, the Fighter Pilot Who Changed the Art of War. He has a famous speech at the beginning of that book called the To Be or To Do speech. And I would urge, you can also just Google this expression, to be or to do. But to me, it is the fork in the road that every young leader has to face in their life. Are you going to be someone who chases rank and credit and getting along with your peers or your supervisors, or are you going to be someone who chases impact and change and truth and, as he said, duty, honor, and country? And those two career paths are not always as aligned as we would like them to be, sadly. So I would urge you to read that book, or at least read that speech. In the back there. Yeah.
Sir, Richard Forthloss Erickson at the company. You said the quote, I'll quote a bad author if the line is good. How exactly do you differentiate a person's character or your view on a person with their ideals that actually align with yours, sir?
Yeah, I think when he's saying a bad author, he doesn't just mean like someone who is historically a bad person, although that might be true. You can learn good lessons from bad people or bad leaders all the time, right? Even a broken clock is occasionally correct. I think what he's saying is that he's willing to quote authors who he might disagree with on essentially everything, but in this one area where they're right, he's willing to draw on that. And so I think about that even in my study of Stoicism. It's what I write about, it's what I'm interested in. But this is also a philosophy that more or less ended 2,000 years ago. And we've had a lot of breakthroughs since then. We've learned a lot of things. And I'd like to think that the Stoics would have incorporated those ideas into their thinking if they were available to them then, or if they were here with us now. But maybe they wouldn't. But that doesn't stop me, right? I would encourage all of you to develop your own philosophy of life, to not be dogmatic or doctrinaire of any school, of any way of thinking, of any religion, of any faith, of any creed, to borrow widely, to read widely, and to take from anyone who is right, to quote bad authors if the line is good, and to be unafraid to disagree with good authors in the moments when they are incorrect as well. Up there. Yeah, the last one. Yeah, you. Yes.
Sir, Mission 4 class is a Kill company. What are some daily challenges and courage that you struggle with, sir?
Yeah, I think anyone who puts out work in the world, especially in this world that we live in that's driven by algorithms, it's driven by feedback. Also, anyone that just wants to be liked by people. You very quickly realize that there's more money and an easier time in telling people what they want to hear, right? Of saying the convenient or the pleasant truths. But that's not the job, right? That's not what being an artist or a philosopher or a writer or a human being, quite frankly, is about, right? My job is to tell the truth as I see it, even when those truths cost me, even when those truths are not as exciting or viral or fun or enjoyable as perhaps other ideas. And when we talked, again, about the need to stay the individual, in my line of work, there's something they talk about called audience capture, which the audience telling you what they want, what they're liking, what they're sharing, what's getting the attention, because it's very easy to be consumed by that, to give people more of that, to give them more of what's working. But if everyone did that, if you only told people what they wanted to hear, you'd not only miss all the things that they don't want to hear that they need to hear, but you'd also never do anything new. You'd never break new ground. The future is dictated by people who push the ball forward, who say those unpleasant things. So just a daily test of courage is, I'm going to say this thing, and I know that not everyone's going to like it. I know that it has cost me too much money to think about right? For certain stands or certain things that I have taken when it would have been otherwise easier to stick with pleasant subjects or topics. Mask. Yeah. Yeah, you.
Sir, exhibit fourth class Williams, Foxtrot Company. Sir, courage is present on every battlefield there is, on both sides of the battlefield. What is a way that we can build the courage of the enemy and prevent our courage from being killed?
Sure. Yeah, it's true. There is courage on both sides. When we talk about courage as a virtue, though, I think it's worth pointing out that quote from Lord Byron, that the cause makes all. You think about the bravery of a kamikaze pilot. You think of the bravery of soldiers in the Confederacy. There is a bravery to it, but it's sort of fundamentally rooted in something unjust or evil, and that hollows out the courage, right? Hallows or hollows, right? It hollows out the courage. It makes it meaningless. So I think understanding that, I think, is important. I like to make that distinction. But as when we think about courage, when we think about our courage versus their courage or whatever it is, you have to have that sense of what's right. I think the belief that what you're doing is rooted in something good is it's the whole shebang, right? Napoleon would say that the moral is to the physical as 3 is to 1, right? You see what's happening in Ukraine versus their Russian counterpoints, knowing that their cause is rooted in something just, that they're defending themselves, that the free world is behind them, is obviously the most important thing that there is. The tricky thing, and this is the tension of courage, is that most people think that what they're doing is right. Lincoln would famously point out that both the North and the South prayed to the same God and thought they were doing the right thing. But it's more complicated than that, right?
Sir, Shipment 4th Class Morgan, Echo Company. Tonight you discussed a lot about courage within the individual and kind of cultivating virtues within itself. How would you suggest that we create kind of a culture of courage and respect and virtue among our peers, but also our subordinates?
That's a great question. And this is where I think the idea of being in it together is so important, right? A collection of individuals will only get you so far, but the sense that the individuals are in it for the person next to them, it's so important. Stephen Pressfield, who wrote Gates of Fire, which would be another book that I would put on that list for anyone looking for book recommendations, he talks about the Spartan phalanx and what made the Spartans so great. The core of their sort of warrior ethos was that their shield was protecting the man next to them, right? The shield wasn't for you. It was famously said of the Spartans that if you lost your spear in battle, it was fine. But if you came back without your shield, all was lost, because it meant you'd abandon the person next to you. And so understanding that we're in this together, that we're part of the same team, that there are no individual decisions, as the pandemic sort of revealed. Our individualist American culture struggled with the idea of collective sacrifice. It's hard. It's hard to get people to do that. So I think the tension, but the beauty of Stoicism is the idea that we are individuals and we can only control what we control, and yet we have an intense obligation to something larger than ourselves, and that collective whole is everything.
We have time for one more question.
Okay, I haven't gotten anyone up there. Let's do, yeah, up there.
Sir, Shipment 4th Class Brian, from Hall Company, 32. In expanding your views through reading opposing or controversial topics, how do you decipher through it to develop your own views, sir?
Yeah, it's the tricky thing. Obviously, people get sucked down rabbit holes all the time. This is what the algorithm does for us. So I do encourage people to read challenging things. I would obviously encourage people to read books, not random shit you find on the internet. If you're learning about it in a YouTube video, just understand this is as superficial a level as there can be about something, right? And I would say this even to people who are one day watching a video of this talk. You have to go in depth. I would encourage you to read books. I would encourage you most of all to read books from a long time ago, books that have stood the test of time, that have been of use for people. But I also think that reading books should be an argument. I write in the margins of the books that I read, not just what I like, but where I think the author is incorrect. And I'm able to do that because, as General Mattis has said, I've read widely on a given topic. I don't just read, one Bill O'Reilly, pop history book about a topic and consider myself an expert about it. I try to go as deep as I can. I try to go to primary sources. And again, I try to read things that have been vetted over time because, getting sucked into a rabbit hole or reading propaganda or misinformation, this is, not just a waste of a finite amount of time that you have, but it can send you down a blind alley for sure.
Mr. Holliday, on behalf of the entire regiment, thank you for speaking with us tonight.
Thank you all.
We have a small gift to show our appreciation.
All right.
Your words are your legacy, and we all hear you. So thank you for sharing them with us all tonight.
Oh, thank you very much. This is beautiful. Thank you.
Please stand by for the departure of the official party. Regiment, attention on deck.